There's a story told of a newly minted ordained minister of the United Church of Canada who was preparing his very first sermon for his very first pastoral charge. He wanted it to be just right, and so he put many, many hours into it, trying to look at it in every conceivable angle. Following that first service, one of his parishioners met with a friend in a local coffee shop, and the friend asked, "So, what did your new minister talk about in his sermon?" The person paused and then replied, "Well, he talked about faith and sin, but by the time he was finished the sermon, I don't know which one he was for and which one he was against." My sermon today is about faith, and so I want to say right up front that I am all for faith, and incidentally, I'm against sin. Basically, there are two parts to faith. One part is our communal faith. We as Christians are part of the worldwide Christian church, and for us, that particularly means being part of the United Church of Canada, and we use as our guide our creeds and other basic elements of our group communal faith. The other part of our faith is our personal faith, the relationship we have with God through Jesus Christ, and that is based upon trust and love. Sin, simply put, is when we turn away from God, when we decide that we're going to place our trust elsewhere, perhaps in other things, other people, perhaps even in ourselves. The thing that underlines our faith is honesty. Honesty about ourselves, honesty about our relationship with God. There are two basic things, I think, about this being honest. First, if you're honest, you'll realize that you just can't go it alone. You can't save yourself. You need God, and I most certainly need God. During my very early teens, I took lifeguard lessons. And among the things I remember learning was that you can't save someone until they are ready to be saved. Because if you jump in the water to try to save them, in their panic and their desire to try to save themselves, they will use you as their personal flotation device. They'll climb up over to you, doing everything they can to save themselves, and quite possibly in the process, they'll end up drowning you. So you have to wait. You have to wait until they are ready to be saved, until they're ready to put their trust in you that you will indeed help them and bring them to safety. Second, if you're honest, you'll admit that everything in life that you have that is good, including life itself, comes from God. This is ever so important because it leads to, again, having even greater trust, even greater faith in God. Is it any wonder then that 12-step programs such as Alcoholics Anonymous has among their key components that we must believe in God and that we can do absolutely nothing. We are powerless without having God invited into our lives. There was once a woman who was riding an elevator in a hotel. While she was riding up a number of floors, around about the 20th floor, the phone rang that was in the elevator. So she went over to the display buttons for each floor, and she opened that little door that was below the buttons, and she removed the phone and placed it to her ear. And what she heard was this: "Good evening. This is the such and such insurance company. We would like to know if you think you have enough life insurance." Now, that's not the kind of call you want to receive when you are riding an elevator, is it? Speaking of phones, last week, for 5 days, I received on my cell phone a particular call twice a day. Thanks to call display, I knew enough not to answer the call. It had a 1-800 number, and it was from the United States, so I figured it must be a telemarketer. Well, as I said, this went on for 5 days, twice a day, So I decided I would check out this 1-800 number. I went online. I punched in the 1-800 number on my search engine on my computer, and two possibilities came up. The first one said, US/CIA. Uh-huh, I thought to myself. And after thinking about that for a moment, I decided I'm going to click on it. So I clicked on it. What did my computer do? All it did was to say that it was thinking. And the little cursor wheel just spun and spun around as the computer began and continued on with its thinking. So I thought, the computer has to think about this, then I should move on to the next one, rather than going further with that. So I clicked on the next one and opened up a website. The website was covered completely with Chinese characters, you know, those beautiful markings that they have in their lettering. And I searched and searched down trying to find some English, but none could be found. But what I did find was literally thousands listings of 1-800 numbers. And because they're in numerical order, I was able to find the one that had been following and calling me. What's my point in telling you all this? Well, my next step was I took my cell phone, and after fiddling with it for a moment or two, I was able to block that number, and I haven't heard from it since. Well, friends, when it comes to receiving a call from God, we don't need to have, shall we say, caller display. And if you think you can block a call from God, well, forget about it. But you can try to ignore a call from God. And in the Bible, we have many fine examples of people who have tried to ignore a call from God. But in each and every case, they failed in their attempt. Why? Because God is even more persistent than a telemarketer. How do you think Abram felt when he received his call from God? Abram and his wife Sarai's response was as such. I think we can call it one of the most pivotal points of our faith history. For their descendants would go on to form 3 world faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I don't sense from the story of Abram that he was in the least bit reluctant about responding to his call to answer in God. I don't hear him asking God, could you, send someone else? You know, Sarai and I were quite comfortable here where we are. We've been living here for centuries with our family. No, I don't get any of that coming from him at all. And so I admire that go for broke, faithful attitude that maintains the focus not on the journey, because that is unknown, but rather on, not on the destination, but rather on the journey. Abram required no assurance and no insurance at all from God. Abram, who God will rename later on Abraham, and Sarai, who God will rename Sarah, I think are very much the model of faith-filled living. Much like planting a seed to grow a tree later on, the couple is asked to have faith that their children and their offspring will inherit the promises of God. In our age of mobility, I don't think we get just how radical it was at that time for Abram and Sarah to pick up everything they had and to just leave their extended family behind. Because you see, in that time, the extended family was everything. They provided you with your identity, your protection. That was the very basis of their society, the very basis of their tribal system. So, how were Abraham and Sarah able to do this? I wonder, how many times did they question their own sanity? In the end, by maintaining their faith in God, they were able to go beyond human thinking, beyond human imagination, and were able to enter into the world of God, the world of great visions, the world of great living, living for God. Every Christian congregation in the world today is living in a time of uncertainty. But also, we are living in a time of call and great promise. Individually and collectively, I think we are the present day Abraham and Sarahs of the world, called together to be a blessing to all the world. We too have a choice. Do we hunker down where we are in fear, or do we move forward in faith-filled confidence in God, that God will provide us with everything we need to carry out our mission of blessing the world? Abraham and Sarah, they opted to venture out into unknown territory, with only God's promise to guide them and protect them. Indeed, in this fast-changing world, Christians, I think, oftentimes feel as if they are in a foreign land, for we certainly are no longer living in a land that is based upon Christianity. In our gospel reading for today, Nicodemus, a Pharisee, a leader of the Jews, pays Jesus a visit by night. Why by night? I think we can assume it's because he doesn't want other people to spot him going to visit Jesus. Why? Because Jesus was considered, especially by the Pharisees, to be very radical in his beliefs and teachings about God. As a Pharisee, therefore, Nicodemus represents all people who are on the inside of a religious institution, and so are reluctant to change. And yet, Nicodemus feels himself being drawn toward Jesus. Change is risky and without guarantees. That is, unless we're focused upon God, unless we trust in God's leading. Nicodemus, we can assume, by his position as a Pharisee, has accomplished everything that a good, faithful person is supposed to accomplish. And yet, he feels deep within himself that something is lacking. And so, what happens? The Spirit of God calls him to approach Jesus. And in this encounter, he becomes a fearless follower of God through the teachings of Jesus. Why fearless? Because later on, Nicodemus in John's Gospel is mentioned one more time in chapter 19, in which we learn that not only has Nicodemus become a follower of Jesus, but he is now a member of Jesus' inner circle. Nicodemus has the bold faith and courage to actually go to Pilate. Pilate, the very one who has the authority to have anyone he wishes put to death, the one who had Jesus put to death. He goes to Pilate and he requests to have the body of Jesus given to him so that he can give Jesus a proper Jewish burial. Hundreds of years ago, sea mariners used maps to illustrate the known world. But for those parts of the world which were yet to be discovered, the map makers would write the words, "Here be monsters." And this was meant to be as a warning about the unknown. Now, certainly our knowledge of the physical world is greater than it was at that time. But we human beings are still afraid of the unknown. Here be monsters. In the case of Abraham and Sarah, they were called upon to make a physical change to move to a foreign land. But more often than not, I think most of us are called upon to make a change right where we are. What if God wants us to do something we're afraid of? We can think of all sorts of fears, can't we, that we have when it comes to the unknown. Things we might be asked to give up, places we might be asked to go, things we might be asked to do. Our fears tend to fill us up, especially when it comes to the unknown. Whenever I feel the call of God to do something and I feel my fears starting to come in, what I've learned to do is to start digging away at those fears, to figure out what is the bottom thing under it all. And what I discover is that I lack trust at times. I lack trust that God will see me safely through. I think we tend to have that belief that God will call us to enter into some sort of wilderness and then just abandon us there, abandon us and give us no support whatsoever. But, my friends, that is not how God works at all. As our United Church Creed begins with the words, "We are not alone. We live in God's world." The good news is, and again, this is where trust comes in. God will work to remove our fears. God will work to fill us with faith. And so we will begin to soar in our hearts and discover abilities and gifts we never knew we even had until we entered and replied yes to God's call. I wouldn't be standing here otherwise. I couldn't be standing here otherwise. I don't know how it happens. I only know that it does happen. It's happening to me right now. And I suspect it's happening to you right now by the grace of God. Amen.